I was on the pirate ships initially, having given up a more or less secure job with Granada Television in their sales and advertising department. So I joined the ship, being tossed in the North Sea to such an extent I became unbelievably thin and dangerously ill. So I came off the ship in 1965, and that spoilt me because I thought I'm not going to go back to another desk job. So the thing was I hunted around, and fortunately there was a vacancy at ABC Television, and their studios were in Teddington. So I went down there, and fortunately I got the job. It was working Saturdays and Sundays, either in Birmingham or Manchester. So sometimes I'd be saying, this is ABC, your weekend television in the north, or this is ABC, your weekend television in the Midlands, glancing at the table to make sure I was saying the right place and the right thing. Anyway, the thing was, what happened, so Monday to Friday, living in London, what else could I possibly do? So I went to Rediffusion, rather arrogantly maybe, and thinking to myself, well, perhaps they will need an announcer as well. But they were mostly out of vision in those days. At ABC, we're in vision all the time, popping up in between the programs. And it was during a period when computers were not sorting out the actual running time of programs. So suddenly what might be just 20 seconds expanded to 30 seconds, and you had to fill all that gap in between. So we were, in fact, more or less presenters rather than announcers, because we were gabbling away doing this, that and the other, talking a load of old nonsense. Sort of the theory was, it's jam tomorrow, you know, keeping the viewers listening and watching a particular channel. Anyway, the thing was that I went along to Rediffusion in Television House, where their studios were for the continuity section and their sales force, and ITN were also in there as well at that time. And I saw a chap called Neil Branson, and I did this little audition. I can't remember quite what form it took, but probably it was, here's a script, let's hear you read it. And he said, well, unfortunately, we don't have a vacancy at the moment. But what happened was the phone went, and I was invited to be a little cameo role it was in No Hiding Place. And in those days, a lot of programs were made on film for lots of reasons. And so I did my little bit. And I'm sure I came here to do that little section there for that program. And then eventually what happened was my agent, I had an agent by this time, and I was told about Stars and Garters. And that was a regular thing for Rediffusion, Associated Rediffusion, in those days. And it went out, I think it went out on a Friday with people like Ivor Emanuel, Kim Cardell, or something similar name, and Ray Martin. That's, my name is Martin, it's Martin with an E, but that's what he called himself. Anyway, the thing was, we stood around drinking cold tea, pretending it was beer, and probably being slightly obnoxious, but that's the way they wanted the program to be. And my understanding is there are still copies of that filming of that particular program. And one has to remember that, as I said earlier to one of your researchers, the thing is that in those days, a tape recording used to be a 2-inch tape. And to edit that up, because they were unbelievably expensive, was a very expensive operation and very time consuming. So some programs, I'm not going to say all of them, but some of them were certainly done on 16mm film. May have been done, as I say, in the studio with a television camera, but there would be a cine camera pointed at a television set, tweaked to perfection with the set and the recording device. And one has to remember, it was in black and white in those days. Colour didn't come along until the early 70s as far as ITV was concerned. The BBC may have pipped them to the post with BBC Two, but that failed miserably, as you know, because there was a power cut. But back to Associated Rediffusion, and the thing was, also here, I mentioned Stars and Garters, I used to run the auto cue. Now, quite by chance, what happened was I got a job with auto cue. It was the Monty Bailey Watson was the sole importer of this device, and it was a device. And Monty Bailey Watson was known as, by his friends, as Monty Bailey Bagwash. But he probably knew all about that. But he was associated with commercial radio before the Second World War. So bringing it forward again back to that time, there I was running the auto cue for Michael Miles and Take Your Pick, a program that started life as a radio program on Radio Luxembourg. But back to him, there was Bob Danvers Walker. I obviously got to know him up to a point. And then there was the chap with the gong, not a particularly tall person. And who was the other one? I've forgotten. That was about it, really. There were 3 stars, weren't there, on that program, including Michael Miles, I suppose. And it was interesting to see how he operated at close hand. And the thing was, why did he have an autocue, you may ask? Well, the thing was, he was of the belief, like a lot of artists, if you start off well, the whole thing moves along. It's got momentum then and all the rest of it. And all he wanted was the opening few lines of his show. It was easy peasy for me, and that was it. But coming back to the device itself, it was very mechanical. The paper on it was about as wide as a kitchen roll of today. And the typewriter was unbelievably heavy. And it used to strike the thing. It would be about this big. Remember, there's no magnifying glass in front. If it was very distorted. And if you had 3 to operate, one could tear, and you had to encourage the presenter, who was trying to appear to be terribly knowledgeable, certainly the BBC. The thing is that he would slowly look towards the camera where it was actually still rolling and not looking at the one that was tearing, and this glazed look would come across their eyes as they were trying to compensate for the fact he'd lost his brain or something. Anyway, that was a fascinating part. And what happened as far as rediffusion is concerned, coming here, we're jumping ahead now to the 1970s when I returned to the United Kingdom from my days in Canada, a couple of years. I did some commercials here because this was a commercial operation, and I obviously it wasn't then owned by Rediffusion, or they were not operating it, but that was my association with Rediffusion. But coming back, I helped Rediffusion to close. So in the last 3 or 4 months of their franchise, to use the correct word, in London, I was one of their announcers. Redvers Kyle was still there, and Muriel Young had galloped off to Granada to be head of children's programs up there. And the other chap, he went off and did some filming. I think it was for a television series. So there was just Redvers Kyle and myself sort of filling in the gaps in between the programs Monday to Friday with Rediffusion during the last few months of their operation before they morphed into Thames Television, a marriage not made in hell, but by the IBA. And that's how it's happened. The IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, as your listener and viewer will remember. It was called the ITA at the beginning, of course. There was a thought they would call it the IRA. No one ever thought, oh, that's got bad connotation. We'll have to call it the Independent Broadcasting. This is a true story. And in the same way, you probably know this one. I understand this to be absolutely true. When the franchise was put up for the northeast of England, it was planned to call it Tyne, Weir and Tees Television. And somebody decided, no, you know what the viewers will call it? Tyne, Weir and Tees Television. So I'm a bit of a, so I'm not going to say the word. Anyway, so they dropped the Weir, which happens to be a much larger river than some of the Tees one especially. But that, I understand, is a very true story. And of course, so it goes on. The only long contract I ever had was with the BBC, and that was a rolling contract, and I looked upon it as being a freelance one. I thought, this isn't going to work. But I was doing bits for Anglia at the time, and one of the announcers at the BBC said, making sure that John Trevor, the chief announcer, I can say what I like about him, but he's moved on now to new areas. He opened his mouth and said, I didn't realize you were still working for Anglia Television. I thought my days are numbered, you see, because the BBC, like some of the contractors, wanted their voices only to be seen and heard in their region and nowhere else, especially if it overlapped, because you were the window, if you like, for the viewers. And that was it. No, I trundled round for the British Forces Broadcasting Service. The most fascinating thing was during the stage when they were going to do a live link all the way from London to Germany. And the reason why they decided to spend, this is the Ministry of Defence, so I'm security cleared now because of that. I think it was an astronomical amount of money. Yes, I remember the amount now. £21 million was this unbelievable amount. But of course, during that period, sadly, the troops were sent off to Northern Ireland, and it was a matter of, this is the days before satellite broadcasting, of course, and they used to watch. And we had viewers in Berlin. There was a special link put up, so where I used to broadcast as well, in Berlin when the wall was up. And what happened was it was featured with me sitting at the console on the 9 o'clock news of the BBC, with me sitting at this great Alice desk, is that right? It was a vast thing. And if I did any training there, I said, look, these are the bits you've got to worry about. 99.9% of the nobules you don't have to worry about. So there I was doing the necessary for them. But that was a fascinating, interesting part. In the same way, it was fascinating and interesting that Rediffusion should ask me to do certain things which came out of the blue. And that's the way it's gone for me. I've done lots of things in my life, ending up by doing training for the BBC and for a major political party, let's put it that way. Behind the scenes, it was an eye-opener, really, for me to do that. But I was asked, and I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity of doing that, was I? Yes, there you are. Well, I do remember how, when ITV first started, everybody had to get a converter to enable them to watch this new monster called ITV. And people weren't interested in spending a lot of money on to something that was unknown. So they had to buy this little box which converted the signal, and the aerial was different as well. Instead of it being a great X shape, or was it smaller, I can't remember, but the size of the aerial altered, and that can be very confusing. But that's what happened. And you have to remember, when ITV first started, people like yours truly would be sitting there watching schools broadcasts going out, which was obligatory at that time. And so it would open and close during the morning, and sometimes it would open up at lunchtime, and then in the afternoon there'd be more schools programs, and then it would start programs proper, if you like. It wasn't an absolute loss leader as far as ITV was concerned, because they were allowed extra minutage for advertising in the evening, so that compensated for the fact they couldn't show advertisements in religious programs and schools programs. When ITV first started, of course, there were two contractors. One was Rediffusion, Associated Rediffusion, and the other one was Associated Television. And they ran the programs for the London area during those early years on Saturdays and Sundays only. This is ATV, and Rediffusion Monday to Friday. Big shows like Sunday night at the London Palladium, obviously, they were live. And before I started working with ITV, this would have been in the 1950s, I got to know the doorkeeper at the Palladium, and he allowed me to come in and sit in the first 2 or 3 rows of the Palladium, looking up the nostrils of these wonderful artists, including Tommy Trinder. I remember this very vividly. What happened was the transmitter I was going to say Bewley Hill. Was it Truly Hill at Croydon? It was a small transmitter, obviously a handmade job, and it broke down. It was never, everybody was hovering around, obviously waiting for a part to burn out or whatever it did. Anyway, at one occasion on a Sunday, the transmitter broke down, and because it was seen only in London, it hadn't spread to Birmingham or Manchester or anything else, it was just purely London area, they stopped the show, and Tommy Trinder entertained us until the transmitter was fired up again. Obviously, it was quite a long break. I would suggest to you that perhaps ATV decided to run a cartoon or something to get people interested that the Palladium is going to start, and it started all over again. But that was a unique experience there. And it used to be live, as I said, during those days. Then it spread up to Birmingham when ABC took over there, and ATV had the weekday franchise. And that was it. And the whole idea of commercial television in those days would reflect the region that it was functioning in. So for example, the West Country would have a farming program, but you wouldn't see one in London. Anglia would have the same, but it would be a different farming program, peculiar and unique for East Anglian farmers. Southern had one. The Midlands, I can't remember if they had one. Probably they did. But that's so things that were unique. There was Anglia. The interesting thing with Anglia, they promised in their application that they would present to the network a number of plays. Their studios up in Norwich were not yet ready for such a large operation, and they actually used the studios here at Wembley to produce their plays. They were done here in this building. Now, not a lot of people know that, but I remember that happening, and it did. They used the facilities here, and that is a fact. I'm not contriving that up in any way, but of course they did Tales of the Unexpected up there. Parts of Norwich were filmed to the nth degree. You're beginning to, you know, and there was the Sale of the Century, where yours truly, when John Benson couldn't do it, I used to shout my little rollicks off, saying, "From Norwich, it's the Sale of the Century," you see. And tapes still around with moi shouting, but I heard it on the BBC, would you believe, recently. I thought, well, why are they using me? Because John Benson, was the one that used to do that on a regular basis. A program that was going to be, last about a quarter, but it went on for 13 years. And there it was, I marveled at seeing somebody like Nicholas Parsons, who's still around doing Time for a Minute or something. He still does it, what's it called? It's got a minute in the title. But anyway, it's still there. I met him recently, and he told me that John Benson had died, and I knew about that. But it was through John Benson doing a program, the original one. There was a talk show. It was the Eamon Andrews Show. And John Benson used to shout the intro into that, and it came from Teddington, or Teddington, as Benny Hill would say. And so he wasn't available to do weekends for ABC in Manchester or Birmingham. So that's how the vacancy came up. So the first talk show in the United Kingdom was the Eamon Andrews Show, who had a contract with ABC, and he used to do World of Sport on a Saturday. And occasionally, only when they were desperate, I used to read the football results. I know nothing about football, and I remember once they kept on patting me down. I didn't know what the signals were, but I was reading them so fast that I couldn't stay up with it, so it was useless. I don't think I ever did those again, but I failed there. But I didn't have an audition for that, you know. How did I know how to say certain words? Anyway, so that was it. Now, there was something else I was going to say. I remember Geoffrey Lugg, who was head of presentation at ABC, phoning me, and we had this discussion. Please, I'm sure he had it with every Tom, Dick and Harry in the business, and saying, we don't know what to call the station, you know, when it morphed from Rediffusion into ABC. This discussion, it almost was going to be called Capital Television, very close to that. Thames, it sounds rather wishy-washy to me, if you'll excuse the turn of phrase, but there you are. And there was Capital Radio followed, of course. They thought, well, this is it, and that's still around even to this day. When ITV first started, and of course they didn't want us to call it ITV, they wanted us to call it by the name. Did you watch Associated Rediffusion last night? Not only was it a mouthful, but half the population, including myself, didn't know how to spell Associated Rediffusion. And so there was a problem there, but most people did call it ITV. The interesting thing is that the IBA, Independent Broadcasting Authority, who used to wag the finger at certain contractors from time to time, did a survey, and they did one in the Birmingham for the Midlands area, and they came up with this statistics to say that most of the people in the Midlands call it ITV. I question that to this day. I bet it was the Brummie accent saying ITV. They were saying ATV, you see, but it sounded to that person from London that they were saying ITV, you see. I'm sure that's right, having worked there as well. No disparaging, nothing against accents, but there you are. That's a fact. Having worked for ATV in Birmingham, it was a facilities company really, and one of the only things they ever did up in Birmingham was Crossroads, of course. And who ever thought? I never thought I'd be sitting with the stars of Crossroads having my lunch. In the same way when I was at Yorkshire, there I was surrounded by Emmerdale, you know. And dare I say, once up in Granada, long before they had it open to the general public, I never thought I'd be walking along Coronation Street. But those are little perks. Working for these different people gave me access to areas and places I never ever thought I'd find myself doing. But I think a lot of people, as far as ITV was concerned, some were snobs, some of the viewers. They wouldn't want you to think they watched. I don't watch ITV. It's like giving them, if they were used to the Telegraph, if you suddenly put the Mirror in front of them and say, I don't read that paper. But they should, you see. I think very broad aspect about this, that and the other. The other fascinating thing was, I do remember in the days when there used to be switches on the top of sets, as you had to actually get off your hemorrhoids and go to the set to change the channel. You see, no more remotes in those days. You actually had to do that. And some people would make a point of making sure it was pressed on one, which would be the BBC, and never pressed down. So if anybody did a little glance, oh, you watch ITV, do you? No, they'd say, etc., etc. But that was it. There was a bit of, snobbiness about the BBC, rather aloof, as indeed it can be still to this day. It's convinced us, of course, we shouldn't say centigrade anymore, but Celsius. That must have been a meeting that went on for many months at the BBC, deciding we've got to make a decision about this somehow. And anyway, I shouldn't say anymore. They might employ me even now. Well, I'll go back to my first days with ABC, and what we had was what was called a routine sheet, which filled up every second of the day, and it allocated this, that, and the other, and you could see if you went through it that I've got 20 seconds to fill here before the next program. And you have to also remember that at the museum switching centre of the General Post Office, a lot of switching went on. So if a program originated in Manchester, or say Coronation Street, the tape was actually running in Manchester. So it was routed down to London and then went out to all the different contractors. Now, if it was from Anglia, well, it'd come down to London and then out to all the different contractors, same with Yorkshire and all the rest of it. So as I said, that's what happened then. And that happened, the switching took place at MCR, Master Control, would be there making sure that the signal coming in was going to match what had gone on before. So that was a job for the boys, if you like. It was very much a visual thing. And one has to remember it must have been extremely complicated in those days, the way that this chap in the museum switching centre was doing his or her job. And that's a fascinating part. As far as I'm concerned with Rediffusion, there I was during its final few months before, as I said, it morphed into Thames Television, where Thames Television actually used the facilities of Rediffusion when it first started. And once again, underlining the fact it was in black and white in those days. Colour had not been introduced into the ITV. And until the Euston Centre was up and firing up, they used the Rediffusion setup. It was very familiar to me, and of course, the beauty was that I was familiar with it as the visiting fireman to guide the peoples who come down and suddenly become the face of Rediffusion. And when the weather forecast was done at Rediffusion, I'm remembering something else now. The weather forecast lady, there used to be a chap called West. I can't remember his first name. He used to do it. He was the male content, and this female came along, and she used to wear a huge mac, for example, if it was going to rain, and she would be seen in vision. We were only seen in vision at Rediffusion, perhaps at the end of the day, and it was wasn't obligatory or anything like that. But sometimes if you felt like it and you weren't dressed right, you would go along and say goodnight to the viewers. And remember, this would have been about just after 11 o'clock. The 24-hour television hadn't started then. And my understanding was, and it may have been because I worked on and off for 27 years, whenever Anglia was desperate, I was going up and down to Norwich. And I was delighted to do it as well. But I think they boasted of being the first 24-hour television station in the United Kingdom. I think that's right. In the same way that Rediffusion, quite rightly so, boasted about where we are now, being the largest television studio in Europe, with its great heavy doors, which are still in operation, I understand today, from the researcher who was in touch with me earlier. Well, the ones the shows I did here at Wembley, well, I always remember Stars and Garters, because along with a friend of mine who I still know, Dennis Duval by name, we were the featured extras. So we were the regulars in the pub of Stars and Garters. The fascinating thing is, of course, people like my good self consuming all this cold tea, which allegedly was beer. We used to call it Stars and Farters, but that was the way it went. And of course, it was extremely popular, and I can't see why ITV shouldn't bring it back. It's the kind of show which would work extremely well. And I mean that most sincerely, folks. The other thing was, that was a catchphrase of Huey Green, if I remember him rightly. Once again, I used to shout the intros to Opportunity Noxa, because that used to come from Didsbury, where it was edited and goodness knows what, and played out to the ITV network. So I did that as well, only occasionally whenever Huey Green who didn't want anybody else to do it. So I used to run down the stairs into the studio there, where the interesting thing about studios at Didsbury, some of the plays from there, not originally, but one of the earlier ones, they were live. They were done actually in the studio. And obviously, being a director, you had to work out which camera could be where to enable them to get to the shot in time to be able to do this, that, and the other. So the whole thing had to be orchestrated, not done in little segments in the way that it is now. So a little scene that might go on just for about, say, 30 seconds, you would record that and then move on to the next one. But then when it's done live, it's a great headache. And there was a time, this is my understanding, I wasn't there at the time, but what happened was this person who was shot dead was seen getting up and walking away from the set, but that it was quite a common occurrence, and I would suspect perhaps it was done purposely. But in the same way that when I was working at LWT, I was one of the featured drop-ins for It'll Be All Right on the Night. And it was shown in North America, and I'm delighted to say I got a nice residual for that, allegedly for being seen. But one has to remember, you get paid more money in America, but there are 280 million of those people living in North America, and there are 65 million of us. So it's all pro rata, and it's all to do with the potential audience that could possibly view you at the time. So obviously the pay out there is somewhat, but it's all to do with the numbers that do watch your program. Well, my introduction to Rediffusion was doing an audition for an announcer, because I was working just Saturdays and Sundays with ABC television, and what happened was that I came along, saw a chap, the head of presentation, his name was Neil Branson, if I remember rightly, and I did this audition, and he told me there was no vacancy currently. Anyway, what happened was the phone went, and I don't think they would have used such phrase, are you interested, but would you like to do a little cameo role in No Hiding Place? And in those days, No Hiding Place was done on film, and I trundled out here to do my little link. I was actually seen on a television set reading the news bulletin, which was to do with the scene, or it was setting a scene, I suppose. And that was it. And that was my earliest time being paid by Rediffusion. London's television, it morphed into, of course. I remember the story of Rediffusion, of course, associated Rediffusion as it would have been in those days, and the opening of these studios here. And as far as the world of television was concerned, and perhaps the great British public as well, they boasted, and quite rightly so, of the studios where we are now in, of being the largest television studios in Europe. And it made one feel rather chuffed to come here and do such programs as Stars and Garters and things like that. You would have thought this is the hub, this is what it's all about. And that was it. But they did have those studios in central London, of course, at Television House. But there was very limited space there. But the interesting thing is, going back even further, one of the joys I had with Rediffusion, and I'm glad I'm remembering this now, was I'd finished work at Granada Television, which was in Oxford Street, London, and rushed down to Television House. And there I was, ready, steady, go, with somebody, Cathy McGowan, who turned out to be my next door neighbour when I lived in West London. I couldn't believe this. And there were all these pop artists used to come along, and they were singing live, actually live. And the thing would be that I got to know some of the cameramen because I would get nosy and interested about cameras and goodness knows what. And the director, quite a well-known director, what was his name now? I can't remember. But anyway, the thing was, when the Rolling Stones were on, they had to keep the shot waist up. If they went further down, they thought it would look rude because he was always thrusting at the bottom. That was the turn on for the girls, of course, and some of the boys, no doubt, as well. But that's the way it was. The interesting thing is, when I was with ABC doing a job for them at Alpha Studios in Birmingham, Stars in Your Eyes was happening downstairs. The difference there was that they all came along and capable of miming to their commercial record. That's how they got that program on the air so quickly in one day. They didn't have to do sound balances or anything like that. So there they are, turning around. But the interesting thing is the technique there was you'd open up with your back to the camera so you wouldn't look as though you were late opening your mouth, you see, or the microphone hid your mouth so sometimes if you couldn't remember the words exactly, but the sound carried on. But all these little tricks, it was to do with incompetence of the person. But they would have well rehearsed, and all they had to do, not all they had to do, but there was Brian Matthew. He was the kingpin introducer of that particular program. So at times, if you looked very carefully, you could see me gyrating around with Stars in Your Eyes. And also, when I was at the BBC, dare I say, doing a bit of continuity, if I finished and there was Top of the Pops downstairs in the days when it came from Television Centre. First it started off in a church, would you believe, in Didsbury of all places, in Manchester. And then it moved down to Television Centre. I used to go down and join the crowd there, poncing around and goodness knows what, and gyrating and pretending I was a weenie bopper all again. But there you are. So I planted myself in three extremely popular ITV programs. And a BBC, try and put the balance right, yes. When I was doing continuity with Rediffusion, London's television, there was a train strike. And ITN used to supply me with a badly typed, remember computers weren't around in those days, a very badly typed script of all the train times and the cancellations that were taking place. In fact, I held on to that script until recently. I moved from where I was to another smaller place and trying to find a place to put things nowadays. But I wished I'd held on to it. But there I was reading out live. All the 5:15 is no longer running. And I thought to myself when I was doing it, how many people are listening to this? They'd be listening on a car radio. How many people have got a television set in there, whatever, you know? So it was just one of those service announcements that scored them points to, with their contract. And that's really what that was all about, I'm sure. So that somebody could easily find out that it is true what I'm saying about that. Plus the chief announcer there, as I mentioned earlier, was Redvis Kyle, and he came from South Africa. He didn't talk with a South African accent, but obviously he was slightly overcompensating the fact that he might be recognized as being South African and not truly English, as indeed I was. And the thing was that he always used to make a point. I've noticed this. He used to wobble his knee up and down when he was doing his announcement. I don't know what was going on down there, but there he was doing that. And he'd be saying, this is Rediffusion, London's television. I used to do it that way. And I started finding myself imitating him. And there was, what was her name? Powell. Was one of the TCs, the transmission controllers, or switchers as they would call them in North America. And she cottoned on. She knew what I was doing. She said, I think you should stop that, Keith. Keith being my name, of course. And that, that was naughty. Well, I suppose the comparison would be when I used to walk into Television Centre and speak to the whole of the United Kingdom saying this is BBC One and things like that. There was something special about that. And there was, in the same way, there was something special about coming here, because here I was and being fully aware this was the largest television studio in Europe. And there was a sense of something special being here. Yes. An interesting point has been raised regarding the future of large studios similar to the one I'm sitting in now, doing and talking to you, slightly off camera maybe for the viewer. Hello. The interesting thing is that big studios are closing, and it really is to do, I suppose, not only just money, but the fact that real locations are used nowadays. They don't need the big sets they once had to build, purely because the equipment was so large and bulky, and it would need all the lighting you could think of in the world to be able to do this, that, and the other. So there has been a cutback on that score. So dramas are in, if you like, real locations. The cameras being small, they can go into somebody's bedroom, if you like, in a real house, hire out a house, and there's a lot of that going on, as you know, with certain programs like Midsummer Murders, who would want to live in those villages in Oxfordshire with so many murders going on and strange goings on, for heaven's sake. Anyway, I don't know, it was like Bergerac. That was done by the same chap who was constantly pouring out the same words week after week, you know, as he stampeded to the car. Another cutaway shot of him doing, which probably recorded years earlier. Anyway, the interesting thing is that the Bergerac and all the murders that took place in Jersey, of all places, having worked for Channel Television, a lot of people know that, I did work for Channel Television, I used to say, no, people it must frighten them off. They don't want to come here on holiday. But there you are, there was Michael Lucas was the head of Channel Television in those days. And I also put forward the suggestion that who wants to come to Jersey and sit in a traffic jam? But that's what it was getting like. I said, if a place like Bermuda, where I've also been, no one is allowed to have a large car. Everything had to be the size and had to be the size of the original Mini, no matter how much money you had. And that's what they got to do in Jersey. Otherwise, people ain't going to go there. But I would suggest to anybody, if they want to buy a second-hand car, buy one that was leased first in Jersey. This has never done any speeding. It never gets anywhere. It may have a mileage to die for, but there you are. End of commercial.
Thank you.